So we're talking about, is the solar system fake? Basically, geocentrism versus heliocentrism. I didn't really have time to put a specific presentation together, but I have a little something about it. I call this how Einstein's flip-flop buried the heliocentric model. I definitely can't cover all of it in 10 minutes, but we're going to go through it. So here's a quote from Einstein. It says, "While I was thinking of this problem in my student years, I came to know the strange result of Michelson's experiment." That's the Michelson-Morley experiment. And he comes down to say, "Since then, I've come to believe that the motion of the Earth cannot be detected by any optical experiment, though the Earth is revolving around the sun." So he just straight up says, I believe the Earth is moving around the sun, but I can't actually detect it with any optical experiment. So this is, of course, that test. They shot perpendicular light rays. They expected that there would be what's called a fringe shift or an interference pattern of a certain amount based on the assumed rotate or revolution speed of the Earth around the sun. They did not see this. So what they actually said was that the apparatus contracted in the direction of motion with length contraction. So it just made it look like the Earth wasn't moving. It's called the most famous failed experiment in history because it was a quote unquote no result. Although if you look closely, there actually was a slight fringe shift. It was just nowhere near the amount expected. So that's what he's talking about when he says, well, we can't use optical experiments, optics being primarily light. So then afterwards, or after this test, they basically had something on the table that they had to try to figure out. And this guy sums it up pretty good. He says the problem which now faced science was considerable, for there seemed to be only three alternatives. The first was that the Earth was standing still, which meant scuttling the whole Copernican theory and was unthinkable. This is Einstein, The Life and Times. And Copernican principle or theory is, of course, the idea that the Earth does not occupy a special or unique position. Here's Einstein again, and the reason that Einstein's important is because his theory is still the mainstream consensus to try to claim that the Earth is flying around the sun. He says here that the struggle back in the day, if it was heliocentric or geocentric, it was meaningless. Either coordinate system can be used with equal justification. Now, that's his claim, because it actually cannot be equally justified, and we'll cover that tonight. But he says the sun is at rest and the Earth moves, or the sun moves and the Earth is at rest, are two equally valid statements. It's just about which coordinate system you prefer. So here he says that the motion of the Earth in space cannot be made perceptible in terrestrial experiments, meaning no experiment on the Earth, so optical nor terrestrial experiments, and that all attempts to measure the orbit of the Earth around the sun were negative, and that before he put the theory of relativity forward, it was difficult to even come up with the reason why that was. Here is Steven Weinberg, well-respected physicist, and he explains that if we were to adopt the frame of reference like Tycho's, in which the Earth is at rest, that's the Tycho Brahe Tychonic model, then the distant galaxies would seem to be executing circular turns once a year. Oh, wow, the galaxy just execute a circular turn once a year? That just makes way too much sense. No way that's real. And he just explains that even with relativity, if you apply general relativity, the enormous motion would create forces akin to gravitation, which would act on the sun and planets and give the motions of the Tychonic theory. And he explains that he brought this up in an unpublished Proposition 43 that did not make it to the Principia. He acknowledged that Tycho's theory could be true if some other force besides ordinary gravitation acts on the suns and planets. I'm covering quite a bit, but I'm just going to try to get through it. So anyway, this is Proposition 43 that didn't make the final publication, which is interesting. And he says, in order for the Earth to be at rest in the center of the system of the sun, planets, and comets, there is required both universal gravity and another force, in addition, that acts on all bodies equally according to the quantity of matter in each of them, and is equal and opposite to the accelerative gravity in which the Earth tends to the sun. And thus, celestial bodies can move around the Earth at rest, as in the Tychonic system. That's Isaac Newton himself saying, in fact, yes, the Earth can be in the center. Here is Einstein. Which is very interesting and telling quote. He says, but when I was a student, I saw that experiments of this kind had already been made, in particular by our compatriot Michelson. He proved that one does not notice anything on the Earth that it moves, but that everything takes place on Earth as if the Earth's in a state of rest. So we can just get this idea out that, oh, all science has proven that the solar system's real and we're flying around it. That's absolutely patently false. Here's more. I'm gonna have to skip through some of this. Here's relational mechanics. So there's two important things to be familiar with. There's something called kinematics and dynamics. Kinematics is geometry, basically. So the geometric paths that the planets move, for example, that's called kinematics, just the actual geometry and the path that they move. Dynamics is what causes that to happen, the force that would cause them to move. Now, everyone knows that just with the term relativity, you should understand there's a kinematic equivalence, meaning if I'm standing on the road and I see a carriage go by, it's like, well, the carriage can be moving or I can be moving. That's basically the principle of relativity. And so relativity says, sure, everything looks like the Earth's in the center and not moving, but just because that's our relative position, they're equally valid. So it's a kinematic equivalence. No one could ever dispute that. That's actually the only way the heliocentric model has even gotten to this point, is to claim that it's kinematically equivalent, as in the way the planets move and we see them, it works equally in both scenarios. But there's also a dynamic equivalent. So if anyone's interested in reading up on it, this is Relational Mechanics by Andre Assis. And he breaks down all the math, all the physics using both Newtonian and Einsteinian mechanics, showing that 100% you cannot claim that the dynamic equivalence does not exist. He proves that it does. Here he shows right here, this analysis shows clearly that in general relativity, kinematically equivalent situations are not dynamically equivalent. And what he actually shows here is that there's a problem with the relativistic approach. It doesn't work. But I don't have enough time to explain all of that. But basically, he says, so if you let the Coriolis term become similar to the Lorentz magnetic force, it might be called a gravitational magnetic field generated by the rotation of the set of distant galaxies, meaning that the angular momentum of all the cosmos moving around the Earth will actually keep it in place. And then he goes on to say the flattened figure of the Earth, of course, assuming it's a sphere, not what this is about, or Foucault's pendulum, can no longer be utilized as proofs of the Earth's real rotation. I've sent this to many PhD astronomers, astrophysicists. They've asked for the dynamic equivalence. None of them have come back with anything other than concession. Here is Dr. Luka Popov. We got a few minutes left. He wrote Newtonian-Machian analysis of the Neo-Tychonian model of planetary motions, where he breaks down, again, the math and physics, showing that there is another interesting remark that follows from this analysis. If one put the whole universe in accelerated motion around the Earth, the pseudopotential corresponding to pseudoforce will immediately be generated. The pseudopotential then causes the universe to stay in that very state of motion without any need for exterior forces acting upon it. So this is saying actually using the Newtonian framework, all the physics, all the dynamics is satisfied. The universe, quote unquote, would perpetually move around the Earth. It would only need a primary mover. An important part here is we saw that Einstein and Newton were explaining, well, if there was an equal and opposite reaction or there was an additional force, well, that's what you would have with the entire cosmos moving around the Earth. You would have a centrifugal force, right? And so one might say, oh, well, the centrifugal force would cause it to keep going in a straight line. But no, there's also a Coriolis force that's twice the magnitude. And in this scenario, it would be a real force as opposed to this pseudo-fictitious force where all the inertial forces are fictitious in the fairy tale that is heliocentrism. And so it would actually be twice the magnitude, a radially inward accelerative force that would keep it in place. All the physics are satisfied. I don't have time to explain the actual problem with Newtonian and Einsteinian mechanics on the galactic scale, but it's obvious everyone knows this. For example, if you look at the actual galaxy rotations, the Newtonian mechanics only yields about 1/10 the value required to even satisfy the physics. Here's Einstein, actually a letter to Ernst Mach, the Machian principle, basically the one. Long story short, 200 years. It took 200 years after Newton for then Mach to come around and be like, wait, Newton didn't even consider the rest of the universe. He only considered the solar system. So therefore assume that if the sun has a bigger mass, we go around it. If you account for the entire universe, which Newton literally didn't even count for, it just assumed it was absolutely just like there, like a background, then the physics would necessitate you say that the Earth could be in the center. This is Einstein writing back to him saying, yes, you're correct. And it would even actually drag the pendulum around. And then this is him saying exceptional relativity says there's no ether. He gets over to general relativity in 1915. And he's like, oh, I was wrong when I said there was no ether. There has to be an ether. And then he says the story of ether is by no means finished. It's continued by the relativity theory. So I got about a minute left, so we're going to move real quickly. Some people will say, oh, well, in order for this to happen, things would have to go faster than the speed of light. That's impossible. Relativity itself says that in the presence of gigantic masses, that the speed of light could actually be superseded. Einstein himself straight up says that according to the general theory of relativity, the law of the constancy of the velocity of light, which constitutes one of the two fundamental assumptions in the special theory of relativity, and to which we have already frequently referred, cannot claim any unlimited validity. So almost no one here has ever heard that, but that's the truth. That's Einstein's own words. The speed of light is not definitive, even according to relativity. Here's a geocentric path just fitting right within a torus field. Here's the more geocentric paths of planets, and you see it has order and it's coherent. It fits right within a torus field. Okay, so long story short, there was an ether vortex measured, and there's no answer for that other than the Earth being stationary, so we can get into it.